Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are coming to us from today. We have viewers from 25 different countries registered today from nearly every corner of the earth. So I guess, Wendy, we came up with an idea that has global resonance. Big thanks to Wendy Cutler and the Asia Society Policy Institute for co-hosting today's event on where we're going next for IPEF. Before we get into today's hot topic, though, a personal note and a couple notes about upcoming WITA programming. This week, the trade community lost a great friend and mentor to many of us, Eric Beale. Eric was a kind and gentle soul. He had a fierce intellect and made lasting contributions in the areas of trade, worker rights, and corporate responsibility. Eric's work will benefit and be felt by millions around the world for decades to come. He was also incredibly generous with his time to WITA and the students of the WITA Academy. And our hearts go out to his wife, Dana, and his boys, David and Josh. Now to more mundane business of trade policy that Eric loves so much and contributed so much to. On December 14th, WITA will be looking back at 250 years of American trade politics, going back to the Boston Tea Party, which took place on December 16th, 1773. We'll pivot off that seminal event in American history to look at where we are today and where trade politics and policy may be going in the future. We have a lot to talk about on December 14th that we had to pack two panels with a who's who of trade luminaries, and we hope you could join us. We also hope you register for our 2024 Washington International Trade Conference coming up in mid-February. Our Cyber Trade Week sale runs through tomorrow, so we hope you reserve your spot today to join us either in person or online. Information on all those events can be found at our website, www.wita.org. If you've been on our more than 250 plus webinars since 2020, and I think Wendy's been on a good number of those, you know we like to call out the names of some of those who are with us at today's event, even if you can't see them online. So welcome today to Magdalena Mosquera at the Embassy of Argentina, Jacqueline Yee in Natural Resources Canada, Dr. Barnaved Sigdal at the Center for Policy Studies and Rural Development in Nepal, Thomas Aquino at the Reed Foundation in the Philippines, and a shout out to my friend Penny Nass with Trade Experts. Welcome Magdalena, Jacqueline, Barnadev, Thomas, and Penny, and welcome to all of you wherever you are joining us from. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have received a copy of our speaker biographies by email a little while ago, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. You can also ask questions of our distinguished panel today using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I couldn't be more pleased than to welcome our illustrious panel here today, starting with our event partner and co-host of many of our earliest webinars when we first came online at the beginning of the pandemic, Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and Managing Director of their Washington, D.C. office. Wendy's also a former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Thank you, Wendy, for helping conceive the event and for your friendship and partnership. Welcome as well to Han-koo, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the former Trade Minister of the Republic of Korea, Marc Mealy, a Senior Vice President for Policy at the US-ASEAN Business Council, Eric Gottwald, a Policy Specialist in Trade and Economic Globalization at the American Federation of Labor and Congresses of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO. And special thanks to our moderator for today's event, Paul DeLaney, a partner at the Kyle House Group and a member of WITA's Board of Directors. Thank you, Wendy, Han-koo, Marc, Eric, and Paul for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you, Ken. And maybe first let me just offer my condolences as well to the Beale family. Eric was a great friend, a true leader, so talented, so collegial, a real loss for the trade community and sort of the business and labor community. So thank you for your tribute to him. I would like to welcome everyone today. It really is a privilege to moderate this panel. We've got an exceptional amount of expertise here to discuss the IPEF. And there's three topics we're going to try to cover. So first off, we're going to talk about each of the panelists will share some perspectives on what were the objectives for the IPEF at its launch, looking at it from business community, governments, labor movement. Then we'll look at what did happen earlier this month in San Francisco, looking at the four pillars that we'll go through each in turn and what has been achieved and what is also remaining on the table in terms of where we did not see as much progress in San Francisco. Then the third topic will be looking ahead. And so we'll get some thoughts from our panel on what comes next, both in terms of implementing some of the agreements that were announced, as well as advancing some of the areas that there are still some questions. As Ken mentioned, there is a Q&A tab. So if you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to weave those questions in as we go. We've also provided some time here at the end, so we'll try to get some more of those questions as well. So let's dive right in. So back in May of 2022, the United States and 13 trading partners launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in Japan. For the United States, USTR leads the trade pillar, which is pillar 1, and commerce has led the 3 other pillars on supply chains, clean economy, and the fair economy, excuse me. We thought that to frame this discussion about what happened in San Francisco, it'd be helpful to sort of start with some top line objectives from different perspectives and stakeholders leading into the IPEF. And with that, so I'll start maybe, Wendy, with you, given all your background working on TPP and Korea and other agreements. If you could just share some thoughts about what were some of the objectives of the administration in launching this initiative, and then we'll turn to our other panelists to weigh in as well.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's really my pleasure not only to be here, but to be co-sponsoring this event with WITA, just a really important and fruitful partnership. So when I think of what the administration wanted to achieve, for me, there are 2 main objectives. The first was to step up our economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. You know, we'd left TPP and the other countries went forward with it. And then the question was, what could we do in this region economically? Because I think the Biden administration was recognizing early on that it could do everything that would be appreciated on the security side, on the political side, but they kept hearing the message, we want an economic agenda too, with a major trade component to it. And so I think they got that message loud and clear. The question was what politically they could do in the region to show our partners we're very serious about economic engagement. And I don't need to go into the facts and figures, but the Indo-Pacific region is kind of the hub of global economic growth. I think just in 2023, this region is going to contribute about 2/3 to overall global economic growth. Innovation hubs, supply chain hubs, et cetera. A real dynamic region, a lot of, many, particularly in the Southeast Asian countries, young populations, et cetera. So that was one important objective. But for me, I also think the other important objective was to promote a new template for an economic/trade agreement. That this administration came in, they said, we're no longer interested in these traditional trade agreements that included market access and other issues. What we want to do is really focus on the pressing, relevant issues in the region, in the world, and so such as supply chains, decarbonization, good governance. And sure, we'll have a trade element, but we don't want to, lift all the chapters from previous free trade agreements. We want to selectively pick those that we think will be not only useful, but also those, frankly, that are not going to cause us a lot of political problems. So again, the IPEF then turned into kind of this new template, which includes trade issues, but it's only one part of this agreement. The other pillars will go into, led by commerce, kind of round out that agenda. And so when we think of it, it's really an economic framework. It's not a trade framework. There is a trade component.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. Maybe, Eric, I could turn to you next. The Biden administration has also been championing its worker-centered trade agenda as sort of the framing concept across the different trade initiatives. And as Wendy mentioned, IPEF is the tentpole initiative in the Indo-Pacific. Could you share some of your thoughts from the AFL-CIO and sort of the labor movement for the IPEF when it was launched as to what objectives and priorities you all have had?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Wendy's big picture framing here. This is definitely, part of the Biden administration's effort to put forward a new model of economic engagement and in the Indo-Pacific. And, I think if you look across you know, the pillar 2, the supply chain pillar, we have the text. Pillars 3 and 4 have been closed. Pillar 1 is still up for negotiation, but if you look across, there is a through line of centering labor rights as a sort of central component. If you look at the supply chain pillar, labor rights are a key component of what they define as supply chain resiliency. There's some innovative mechanisms in there to forward that in pillar 2. Pillars 3 and 4, there are also labor components. Pillar 3, the decarbonization pillar, centers labor rights and respect for labor rights as part of sort of a just transition away from carbon intensive things to green energy solutions. So we do definitely think that there's some innovative thinking here. We do see the labor focus that we expect from this administration. But this is all being done, as Wendy points out, in a very different way. This is not a traditional FTA in any sense of that term. So I'll leave it there for now.
No, thank you. I think we will certainly get into that, some of the challenges and opportunities, you know, of a new model or a new approach, but also it inevitably is benchmarked against whether it be, you know, labor provisions or digital provisions or commercial provisions against what we've done in the past. That's a good transition, Marc, to you. Certainly the business community has been focused, as Wendy mentioned, on the Indo-Pacific region for some time and committed to advancing investment and trade and commercial activity. Maybe you could chime in here and offer some thoughts on what the business community and also not just US, but more broadly in the ASEAN region, what they were looking for as IPEF launched.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. So I think, you know, when we first obviously heard about IPEF and began to engage, the US-ABC obviously was pretty excited because literally half of the members of IPEF are countries in Southeast Asia, in the ASEAN region, which is obviously where we focused on. And we understand, and I think the business community understands that, you know, these economies are fast-growing economies, as Wendy has highlighted. They're very competitive. They're also challenging for American-based companies that are looking to invest, U.S. exporters and multinational companies. So I think at the outset, you know, it was hoped by the business community that IPEF would be able to address, you know, issues around market access, IPR issues, digital trade, and other areas of, you know, commercial significance by promoting, you know, high standards, disciplines, and commitments that would expand commercial activities. And as you said, maybe be on par with other types of agreements that the United States government has historically done. US-ABC, we saw IPEF really as the first of what really needed to be many steps, given, as Wendy mentioned, really sort of the US government being absent at the Asia regional trade policy table for many, many years. And we also thought, again, that maybe it could be a new opportunity, a new platform to deepen US-ASEAN relations. I think in terms of the ASEAN perspective or the ASEAN member state perspectives in IPEF, in talking with a lot of trade officials from the region, they clearly welcomed IPEF. I can say, though, it maybe wasn't their first, second, or third option from, you know, ASEAN member states, but definitely welcomed it. And I think they saw it again, as Wendy correctly said it. They were looking for the United States government to step up in terms of deepening economic engagement. And if given our politics, and they understand our politics, having navigated our politics in previous efforts, they said, okay, we welcome this. I think last but not least, the ASEAN member states saw IPEF as an additional sort of initiative to what the many other regional trade initiatives that many of the ASEAN member states are involved in, whether it be RCEP, CPTPP, and other bilateral initiatives. So it was an additional, as opposed to like, oh, we're going to focus on IPEF and not do the other things. Like, no, we're going to keep doing the other things, but now we're going to add IPEF into sort of our card. And I think there was appreciation of maybe the innovative template of having sort of these parallel processes in terms of the various pillars that gave countries the opportunity to choose to be in one or not in one in the other three. I think that was also welcome going into the, sort of the launching of this effort. And I think that's where we, kind of got our good sense of how we could try to be supportive of the process.
Thank you, Marc. That's a good transition over to you, Han-koo, sort of maybe to dive a little deeper about the region and sort of the expectations or the hopes as IPEF was launched from South Korea, but also from other partners in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I think Wendy and others set the scene very, well and eloquently. I think, the member countries in the Indo-Pacific obviously welcome the U.S. engagement in this economic field. But obviously, at first, they expected and hope that the U.S. could come back to CPTPP, but obviously, the political, circumstance in the U.S. is not really, feasible. So I think there was kind of lower expectation about sort of traditional types of elements in IPEF, whereas there was really increasing kind of need among these countries, especially in the supply chain and the decarbonization, because that was a time when these countries really were sort of coming out of this, the pandemic and all these supply chain disruption and shocks, etc. But also there was time when all these countries were really kind of putting up, ambitious the mitigation, carbon mitigation, CCC. So I think there was sort of a kind of a new sense of the need for new type of template or kind of a playbook for these new challenges that all the global trading system is facing. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. And I'll quickly just sort of then move us forward. So from the launch, there were 7 negotiating rounds completed, including 3 in-person ministerials. The last ministerial and the last round were in San Francisco several weeks ago. As we noted already, the structure evolved into this 4-pillar structure, and we'll talk about what was achieved here shortly. One dynamic too that developed, I think, over the course of the negotiations was from the outset. I think, Wendy, you touched on this. The administration was clear that in their view, what they were trying to move forward did not fall within the more traditional comprehensive trade agreements that traditionally would then require implementing legislation in the U.S. Congress. I think that topic continued to evolve over the course of really beginning in December of last year, with the Senate Finance Committee expressing concerns about that approach, given that the article on Section 8 authority on trade and regulating foreign commerce does sit with Congress. And then as the hearings last year on the trade agenda came forward, this question sort of continued to come up. Moreover, and I think, Marc, you alluded to some of this, we saw both from Congress, but also from stakeholders, they were articulating different priorities as to what they felt should or should not be in the IPEF, and putting down some markers that were often contrasting, if not contradicting, with each other. So I think that set up for San Francisco some challenges, both politically, but also substantively. And Eric, to your point about not using the old model, the question is, well, what is the new model, and how do you memorialize that? And concepts such as enforceability or market opportunities sort of rose to the forefront. But why don't we go ahead and jump into what did happen? One other point, sorry, before we get to San Francisco. The one substantive negotiation that was concluded in advance was on Pillar 2, on the supply chains. I believe it was May of this year. That was actually signed in San Francisco, but that was sort of the first chance that we got to see some text or some concepts as to how some of these new pillars may operate. So I thought that might be a good place for us to start, is with the commerce pillars, which were both, one was signed and 2 others were substantially closed. And then we'll pivot to the trade pillar that remains open and talk through some of the issues that have arisen there. So why don't we start again then with Pillar 2, the supply chain agreement. It was signed on November 14th. Maybe Eric, we were talking a little bit beforehand. Maybe start with you. You mentioned that the sort of the through line in a number of these initiatives on the labor rights side. If you could talk about sort of your assessment of the supply chain agreement, and then I'll pivot to Han-koo and Wendy, who wrote on this topic about what could be achieved at IPEF, and then Marc, you can come in behind and offer some thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I think as Wendy mentioned, look, the supply chain pillar, pillar 2. This was an effort to, I think, get these countries together and for the U.S. to show leadership coming out of the pandemic with all the supply chain disruptions we all experienced. So I think it was conceptually this is a well-chosen topic, and you saw that I think every single IPEF country signed up for this pillar. So there was interest there. I think what came out of this is a very good framework for cooperation. There's a number of elements here that I think are encouraging on paper. The proof of how useful any of this stuff will be is really going to be, do the countries show up and participate? Are these committees that are created? There are several committees created. Are folks going to actually utilize this? And so that's TBD, right? But I think we do like some what's on paper here. Secretary Raimondo and her team did a very good job in ensuring that the definition of resilient supply chains includes respect for internationally recognized workers' rights. And that sounds like a small thing, but I think given this region and some of the countries involved, I think that's a great start to have that included in there. It created a few mechanisms that we should keep our eye on, and one is a labor rights advisory board, and this labor rights advisory board is going to make recommendations to countries and companies on how to improve labor rights in priority IPEF supply chains. So the countries will determine what are the priority IPEF supply chains, but I'm sure we can all think about critical minerals, solar panels, other things that could end up on this list. Also very interesting that this Labor Rights Advisory Board is tripartite. So they're borrowing from the International Labor Organization model. So we're going to have unions from across the IPEF region, employers and governments all sitting on this Labor Rights Advisory Board. And I think that's a productive model in this region to encourage the governments involved to see trade unions as a social partner that should be at the table for these discussions. The last thing I'll flag with Pillar 2, there is a facility-specific complaints mechanism here that will allow civil society to raise questions and allegations with potential labor rights noncompliance at facilities in the IPEF region, and it require the parties to investigate and report back to the IPEF group. So I think some potential there. This is a very light touch version of the USMCA's rapid response mechanism. That could be achieved in sort of this non-binding supply chain context. So those are my thoughts on that.
No, thank you. And I think that last point you made in the sort of the cooperative framework versus the sort of binding enforceable framework. I mean, that's where this runs through this as well. Han-koo and Wendy, maybe Han-koo first, you guys shared some thoughts on what could be accomplished on supply chains and IPEF. Would welcome your kind of impressions of the agreement that was agreed to and sort of its potential, and Eric's points about how invested will the countries be in standing up these councils and advancing this work.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm happy to do so. Let me use analogy here. I think the traditional CPT people or FTA, those trade agreement, I would, compare as a cash. But I see this IPEF as a sort of a promissory note. It's not the cash in hand, but in the future, depending on how you use a credit, you can buy good stuff, you can invest in the really good future potential, etc. So I think first we have to really discern the difference between the traditional FTA and also this kind of new IPEF in assessing the impact. So with that, the supply chain, I think Wendy and I, made the report, published the report last May, and actually one of our, recommendation was to use sort of a sector-specific approach. Especially, we highlighted this critical mineral and the material sector because that was really hot, and everybody, the feels an urge to diversify and cope with some contingency just in case. So I think one thing to really note from which came out of this summit is at the summit, the IPEF summit, these leaders announced this the launch of IPEF critical minerals dialogue. It was not at the level of just kind of ministerial statement, but at the leaders the level. So I see that IPEF partners put a lot of political weight on this initiative. So I think, but this is named as a dialogue, but I think it should really go beyond just a talk shop. Because if you look at what happened between the last May when the the substantial conclusion was announced, and then now, I think in the meantime, China imposed this export control on this critical, this rare the materials. For example, I think what was it? Gallium and germanium and graphite. And for example, graphite. This is critical for this EV and battery supply chain. And Korea and Japan, they depend on China for more than 90 or 95%. So this is really critical. So I think what, with this kind of newly created this framework, what they have to do is first in the short term, they really need to show how this supply chain framework could help and then the work in this potential contingency of economic coercion or some market induced the supply chain shock. So I can go on and on, but I just it's in the interest of time. But also in the medium term, what is important is to really kind of put together resources to diversify, accelerate the diversification of highly concentrated supply chain. So I see that these IPEC countries really kind of put emphasis on this investment initiative. So I think what the countries in the region want is to create these co-investment opportunities out of this. So I think there needs to be some work to address these investment grievances that companies face in the region by creating some sort of kind of one-stop shop or this sort of mechanism. And also recently I met some the financiers in the Wall Street, and then they say that, for example, in order to invest in this mining, also there needs to be investment in infrastructure, because in many developing countries, they have mine, but they don't have road, they don't have power, they don't have water, so obviously there needs to be investment in this infrastructure. But if just one agency in one country, for one agency to invest, there's too much risk. But if there are like a consortium of like-minded countries, agencies, and institutions put together resources, I think that could really accelerate. So I think these are the things, some of the things that they could do this with implementation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Wendy, I'll turn to you and Marc maybe for some quick comments. And one question that came in, I think it was a good one, was about, aren't supply chains really about companies and how companies interact with each other, and shouldn't they be central to this? I would say sort of a corollary question maybe for you, Wendy, is we have done trade facilitation and multimodal commitments, a lot of things that are the sort of the networking of the supply chain and agreements for some time. We'll get to Pillar 1 where there was some discussion about trade facilitation. But maybe Wendy and Marc, a couple high-level thoughts on the supply chain agreement, then we can spend a few minutes on the other commerce pillars, then turn to trade.
Well, just, a few comments. First of all, I think both pillars for both pillars 2 and 3 in particular, commerce had a clean slate. And so we need to keep this in mind. They weren't like building on former agreements, right? So in that respect, I think that in both pillars, they really achieved some meaningful progress. And the proof will be in the pudding, because in many ways, they've set up a structure for engagement, identified issues to work on, and set up these different, not only this labor advisory council, but they also set up some kind of crisis management system, and then an overall supply chain council. A lot of process, but maybe this process will be helpful as countries come together and try and tackle these issues. So on balance, I think it's, you know, a good step forward, but I will just underscore that in many respects, it still reads like a framework agreement. It doesn't read like, you know, like hard commitments of what countries, to the extent that governments can take actions with respect to supply chains. And it's a great question, because governments do have roles. Governments can incentivize the location of supply chains. They can help facilitate trade. They can they can offer some penalties as well. So they play a role, but obviously at the end of the day, many of these decisions need to be made by private companies. And so I think it will be important that the private sector is involved in the implementation of pillars 2 and 3, because decarbonization also, you need the private sector there as well. So I think that with labor, business, and governments in both of these pillars, that useful work can be done going forward, given the kind of structure for engagement provided by IPEF. I would also just say that in hindsight, maybe some of the trade facilitation provisions should have just been moved to the supply chain pillar, and no one would have, associated them with the trade pillar, and they could have gone through, because I think that a lot of good work was done on trade facilitation. And frankly, if you want supply chains to operate smoothly, trade facilitation is like a key component for achieving that.
Yeah, and then building on it too, I mean, we have a legacy of rules and commitments and that have been implemented in a series of agreements. So there is sort of a playbook, if you will, to benchmark against. But Marc, any other closing thoughts on supply chain that we'll pivot?
Yeah, just to wrap up, I mean, I think again, two final points. Number one, I would say there's no question. I think there is a recognition by both the government side, but definitely the private sector, that at the end of the day, the private sector has to really be involved in these future processes. For example, we know that one of the objectives of the governments in negotiating this particular agreement post-COVID, right, was we need more information and data about supply chains, right? And of course, that was basically saying to private sector, we need more information and data about your supply chains so that maybe from a data-driven perspective, we can identify, constraints or weak spots, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, that's probably going to be a very interesting conversation between governments and private sector folks, given potentially some of the proprietary nature of that kind of data and information. So there's got to be a mechanisms or processes to figure that out. But then one last point, maybe just to tie a bow on the original point, one of the things I definitely heard from a lot of ASEAN member trade officials on the supply chain negotiation, and maybe this is again, a reflection of, again, they operated from a clean slate. This was a sort of a new effort, was a sense that the provisions around labor and provisions around environment that were woven into that effort were pragmatic and realistic for the partners, to so to speak, because there was a lot of clarity, a sense of saying that if the desire at the outset were to create, let's say, USMCA level of commitments around, labor, environment, those kinds of things, without, of course, the inclusion of USMCA level commitments around market access and other kinds of things, it wouldn't have worked. The fact that we got to an agreement probably would not have happened in the way that it did happen. So I think that new model a degree of pragmatism at the end of the day allowed for this pillar 2 and even to be successful to where it is today. But clearly, it's more of a process that has to go forward.
Well, and that's an excellent preview. We will get to the trade pillar here in a moment. But in turning to the clean and fair economy, so pillars 3 and 4, we did see, and the leaders announced, and Secretary Armando announced the substantial conclusion of negotiations. Rather than spend too much time on it because we don't have the text, it did list a series of objectives. And I think, Han-koo, as you said, that these agreements are sort of putting in place a framework of what are the types of issues that the countries can work on together. They have more work to do, which is to memorialize this more into a text. But any thoughts anybody wants to share on those 2 pillars, and then we'll pivot to the trade pillar.
Thanks, Paul. I can speak on this clean energy pillar. As you mentioned, yes, I think the jury is still out there, and the ultimate success of this IPEF is not going to be judged by the conclusion of the agreement, but actually by the implementation and how they could produce tangible and concrete outcome out of this framework agreement. So that's why I think over and over I emphasize the importance of implementation compared to the previous this traditional FTA. I think this clean energy is kind of promising because this is first of its kind. I mean, we've never incorporate this decarbonization element into CPTPP or RCEP or any of these previous, FTA framework. But this is sort of a first time that, this, in this kind of economic / trade agreement, cover this decarbonization pillar. So in that sense, I look at this statement, and the text is now available. But when I look at from this, joint statement, looks like it appears that normally it's an aspirational commitment, principles, and also some of the mechanism and processes. But also it appears that they look at sectors or transportation, agriculture, forest, etc. So it looks like they really use the combination of this general and also the sector specific approach. With that said, I highlight kind of a tool, the policy instrument, which could be useful in this implementation phase. First, I think they announced that this Clean Energy Investment Forum, the first one annual, but the first one in Singapore early next year. And also they announced this the launch of IPEF Catalytic Fund. The size of this and how it will be raised and what the size will be is not clear. But I think still there's a kind of market is not fully created. And then there's government intervention in this kind of green market in cooperation with this private sector. I think that could create good the spillover effect. And then secondly, they also created the cooperative work program, this old capital letter. So the CWP looks like try to carry out the concrete project like hydrogen or carbon market. For example, I see that the carbon market is very kind of promising because in these Asian countries, for example, Korea, Japan, Singapore, they put a very ambitious mitigation target, but they cannot do all this mitigation inside Korea, inside their nation, and they desperate to identify international partners. So what they could use is this sort of international carbon market in which these companies from developed countries invest in developing countries mitigation project, and then they are issued with this carbon credit and bring them in and then use to meet their target. So this is a way to really mobilize huge private capital in order to mitigate this this emission in the developing country. So I think in summary, yes, it's a still kind of framework, but they also include kind of a useful kind of a policy, the instrument to implement. So depending on how they use it, I think it has a good potential to make an impact.
No, thank you. And maybe I think in the interest of time, we've actually covered some of what comes next for Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. And I did want to give either Eric or Wendy or Marc if there was any particular points you wanted to highlight on either the clean economy or fair economy. But if not, we could also hit those at the end. Maybe we can pivot to the trade pillar. Does that work? Okay, good. Yeah. So as noted, so on the commerce side, we've got sort of work plans. We have council that have been stood up. We have the supply chain agreement. There had been, earlier in the year, some expectations that we may see an early harvest in the trade pillar on some of the areas where through those 7 rounds of negotiations, the countries were working diligently on a whole series of topics. There also were these concerns that came up earlier about, well, what is being included, say, on the digital space, or what's being included on labor rights in terms of enforceability or binding commitments or environment. I think maybe we could just start with, I'd welcome kind of your thoughts, each of your thoughts on why we didn't end up with at least our early harvest, and sort of your assessment of where we are on the trade pillar, given I would say little progress, at least externally, in terms of what exactly they're trying to accomplish. Unlike the other pillars, we just maybe start. Maybe Marc, I'll start with you. Given the business community has a lot of ambition that you would articulate at the beginning of what they hoped. How do you see Pillar 1 and where we are? And,
Sure.
and then I'll rotate around and give everyone a chance to come into the question.
Definitely. So I think those of us have been in this town for a long time and, done, quote unquote, the history of trade agreements, in a sense, the old way or the historical way of doing these types of agreements, environment. Not a whole lot of surprise that Pillar 1 was going to be the more complex, more challenging pillar to move forward on. And again, as Wendy kind of mentioned, given political choices, what to include, what not to include, would always, again, I think probably would have offered some challenges particularly for other IPEF member countries who, again, are involved in so many other additional efforts at the same time. And in a sense, we always knew IPEF, particularly Pillar 1, was really going to have to compete with the various other initiatives that many IPEF member states are involved in. And if at the end of the day, if it couldn't compete, then what was included or not included might make a real difference in terms of how fast the countries could go on. I mean, just for the record, US-ABC, when IPEF first started, we actually offered a recommendation that when it came to the quote unquote digital elements in Pillar 1, we actually recommended that maybe that should be done in a separate pillar in recognition of some of the points I just highlighted. Complex challenges, having to compete with a lot of other initiatives that are already underway that, again, include certain things or maybe don't include certain things. And again, we understood the thinking at the time of why Pillar 1 was going to include digital, trade facilitation, ag, labor, environment, all those kinds of things. But again, given our knowledge and understanding of what was going on in the Indo-Pacific region, we knew that would probably be very, very challenging. And this is not even to say, given the fact that we also, of course, now know that on the question of some of the digital issues, the administration was also in the process of really resetting or reforming some of the fundamental positions of U.S. trade policy on digital kinds of issues, which then obviously is going to add another complexity or challenge to the Pillar 1 process going forward. So in that regard, again, we're glad to hear that there's some really progress has been made on some of the other trade facilitation, ag, those kinds of things. But obviously, again, finding the other kind of consensus points is definitely going to take a much longer period of time.
No, thank you. And I think I'll turn next to Eric and Wendy, but you sort of teed up, two dynamics we saw leading into San Francisco. One was Senator Brown raising some very serious concerns about enforceable labor commitments and would they be included and whether there should even be a trade pillar, if not. But also, almost at the same time, Marc, to your point, we saw a lot of bipartisan negative reaction to sort of walking back on certain commitments the U.S. had been putting in prior agreements related to data flows, data localization, source code. So on substance, there was quite a bit of frustration, I think, coming at least from the Hill and certain stakeholders. I'd be curious, Eric, kind of your sort of assessment of what was kind of heading into San Francisco and what the trade pillar, could achieve or even should achieve from your perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not surprised that the trade pillar did not close. As has been pointed out, it's fundamentally different from the other three pillars. We have a long history in the with trade agreements. USTR has existing text, and expectations that come along with each chapter that they put forward. And let's also step back and remember that a number of these countries, Indonesia, Thailand, were not in the TPP. They've never gone through a trade negotiation with the United States. So the idea that the trade pillar was going to move and close along with pillars 2, 3, and 4, I don't think was realistic. I think what you saw at the end is, I think they were able to make progress on good regulatory practices, trade facilitation, a number of sort of the technical, chapters that, are important to trade. But then, on labor, environment, digital, the parties, there's two dynamics happening. One, the parties were not in alignment, and on digital, let's not forget that, this is not just about the U.S. taking a pause and reassessing our priorities in digital and carving out more space for our Congress, which, by the way, we've fully support Ambassador Tai's decision to do that. It's also about looking at the parties in the IPEF region. Indonesia, is very different from Singapore when it comes to the digital economy and their ideas for regulating the digital economy. So this was never going to be easy with this group of countries, and it was never going to be easy on labor either. Ambassador Tai, I think, rightly tabled a very ambitious labor chapter, and of course, this is a signature issue for this administration. So I think going forward, it's not going to be easy to close the gap on these outstanding chapters. But from our perspective, with this administration's focus on labor, with the labor challenges in this region, we don't want a cosmetic, watered down labor chapter just to get one. So I think there's a lot of work left to be done in 2024. The politics here are going to be tricky. This could go into 2025. Hard to say where it goes from here, but I guess that's my take on it.
No, thank you, Eric. And we've actually had a number of questions come in as well about, I guess, sort of the more structural question, right? Is the U.S. or can the United States engage in some of the more, tariff liberalization or the broader kind of market access? Certainly, that was not part of the discussions in San Francisco. Maybe Wendy, turn to you, and then Han-koo, come back to you next to sort of think about or to comment on the views from the region, kind of where we are on the trade pillar, coming out of San Francisco. But Wendy, I want to get your thoughts. It does seem that we have a challenge, right? That getting high standards, be it labor standards, be it digital standards, and to Eric's point, there are different views on what high standards mean, on digital certainly, and labor as well, or environment, or whatever it may be. And without sort of the more traditional commercial market access elements of the agreement, what is your take of what did or didn't happen in San Francisco? But as we go forward, how do we sort of chart out that course? And can we get those high standards? And if not, what is sort of the plan B or plan C, or what could it be?
And there's always a trade-off, right, between high standards and then the number of members and the diversity of the members. And so from the get-go, on one hand, it was incredible that the U.S. government could attract 13 other partners to this initiative. And even though there was a flexibility, you didn't have to join all the pillars. It was just one country, India, that didn't join the trade pillar. So I give the administration kudos for attracting such a large and important group of members to IPEF. When I take a step back, early harvest agreements are always tricky, because what you're basically saying is we're done with this set of issues and we're going to go ahead and put it into effect. And then there's always the concern that the other issues, which typically are more difficult, that there will be lack of political will or resources or interest to do that hard work. And so that's why in trade agreements, we always hear about the single undertaking. You have to do everything at the same time. Maybe you can park chapters, meaning you're done with them, you put them to the side, but you don't implement them. I think what happened here, which is a bit unfortunate, was that the US decided that early harvest made sense. There were a number of chapters that were moving quickly and looked pretty non-controversial. Eric mentioned a number of them, trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, inclusivity, capacity building. All of these, they sound pretty easy. But again, I think there was a concern that if you harvest those, are these other countries really going to sit down with us and slug it out on labor, environment, and digital, and have we lost some leverage? So again, I think it was just unfortunate how the US, was pushing these other countries to conclude certain chapters and to harvest them. But then, a few days before the leaders get to San Francisco, they need to inform our trading partners, you know what, we're no longer interested in early harvest. And I don't think this was like a huge, from a substantive point of view, I don't think there was like a huge disappointment that the world as we know it was going to be different. But I think this does contribute to a perception among these other countries that we're just an unreliable partner when it comes to these issues, that our domestic politics have not gotten any easier since we left TPP on these issues. And we still have a lot of internal work to do, and it manifested itself, regionally in the IPEF. I want to give just credit to our trading partners here, because privately I heard from a number of them, and let's just say those comments were pretty candid. But publicly, they all put the best face on this, and I think this just underscores their true desire to have the United States economically engaged in the region, even if it's not in the shape or form that or the substance they would prefer. But if you read the leaders' IPEF statement, they do talk about continuing work. I think Eric was a little generous, saying 2024 will be tricky. My view is I think it's going to be nearly impossible to make progress on any of these politically sensitive issues. I don't think we're going to have a lot of flexibility. I think our trading partners are going to be watching our election and probably asking themselves, why do we make big concessions now? Let's see how the election comes out. And then just to complicate things further, Donald Trump came out and basically said he would tear IPEF up like he tore up TPP, which also I think just kind of makes it difficult to have a real substantive negotiation where progress can be made in 2024.
No, thank you, Wendy. Maybe in Han-koo, maybe you can pick up on that some, and just would welcome your thoughts, for the other IPEF trading partners, working on the trade pillar and looking ahead, kind of what could be achieved. And then I know we're getting close to time. We could spend maybe another minute or two at the end on sort of the challenges ahead. But Han-koo, first, maybe if you could share some thoughts, from the regional perspective.
Yes. As I said at the outset, I think they understand the political reality in the U.S. So they had low expectation, but still it's a bit disappointing. I think the region in the Indo-Pacific, the supply chain shift, and then this trade integration is moving so fast. Actually, one of my Peterson colleague, Mary Lovely, she analyzed that, yes, this export from this region to the US is increasing instead of China, but the trade between China and this region is increasing. Actually, that's due to partly due to RCEP. The favorable rules of origin, and then this trade integration in RCEP. So I think what US could do to really engage in the region and remain relevant is, I think, two ways. One is a market access, but yeah, it's not really feasible. The second, now US is doing all this industrial policy, and then, for example, IRA, they could provide this IRA incentive to the region with this, critical mineral related, but also I think US is not really acting on this part as well. So, I think it's unfortunate that, this US is kind of falling behind unless they really try to get back in the game with this substantive incentive scheme. Lastly, I think it's time for the middle power countries in the IPEF to really step up. The next year will be very, very important despite the political calendar in the US. So I think it's rather than just wait and see what happens in the US and this the hub and spoke system in which US is at the center of everything. I think it's time for middle power countries in the region to step up. Thank you.
No, thank you. And maybe I'll give everybody a last comment if they'd like to add on sort of prospects moving forward. Two observations. I mean, one, and Wendy, you alluded to it. I mean, one of the challenges, I guess, structurally is as painful as negotiating our free trade agreement, a comprehensive agreement, and moving it through Congress is, it does provide durability. And I think some of the challenges we're talking about, arise from what happens in a new administration or what happens in trying to get these concepts really drilled down into actual concrete results. Some of it is structural, and I think that how the Congress and the administration interact, on IPEF in the weeks and months ahead and through the election, it is critical in trying to sort of maybe reestablish some of that sort of shared purpose. But I know we're almost at time. I'll give you each maybe 30 seconds, a minute, if there's anything, just your line of final thoughts, how the IPEF moves forward in the years ahead or weeks ahead, months ahead, and then I'll turn it over to Ken. And I apologize, we had some great questions. Some of them are pretty technical, very specific. So Ken, we can maybe try to respond to those separately. But who'd like to start? Maybe Marc, any initial or closing thoughts, and then we'll just I'll go around.
I think number one, again, thanks for this being part of this great conversation. I think, in talking to our member companies that are, again, active in the markets of Southeast Asia, we do look forward to continue to sort of engage in the operationalization of Pillar 2 and eventually 3 and 4 when they come forward. I think, again, the opportunity for future events and programs that the ministerial body will try to organize, I think that's very positive if they're held, and again, in some of the 7 ASEAN member states. I think the ASEAN governments that are part of IPEF, as Wendy said, they're going to continue to be at the table. They're not walking away from anything. So again, that's very positive. Again, I would note, I think we all want to understand, on Pillar 1 and some of the, quote unquote, digital issues, however that process moves forward, we're looking forward to 2024 is going to be another big year for the 10 ASEAN countries are launching new initiatives to develop regional frameworks for digital issues. As well as even, from AI to cross-border data flows. So there, once again, there's going to be a lot of competing initiatives that half of IPEF are going to be involved in as the Pillar 1 process continues to move at the pace that it's moving. So I think we have to understand those contexts as well.
If I can just add there, also China is upgrading their FTA with ASEAN, looking at issues like digital and others as well. So that's something that we need to keep our eye on. My concluding remarks really, the core would be, there was a setback in the trade pillar, but we'll all get over it. And that we should just keep in mind the good work that was accomplished and the structures going forward for further engagement, and the fact that other countries kind of went with the ebb and flow of our position. And I think that just underscores how much countries in the region want the US to be economically involved in the region, and we're willing to kind of go along with, okay, we're not announcing anything on trade, let's continue our work. I view that as all very positive.
Maybe Han-koo, last words, and I'll let Eric, we'll finish with you and then hand it over to Ken.
I think I said enough, so thank you very much for this great panel.
And then Eric, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, I think this is going to be very, I think pillars 2, 3, and 4 are, I'm very interested in to follow how they develop over the next few years, regardless of what happens with pillar 1, the trade pillar. I don't think any of us know where that's going to land. But what's already been agreed to is, I think, is interesting. And I think we'll be following it all closely and participating in some cases. Yeah, let's TBD. We're all stay tuned.
Well, I'll close with challenges ahead, but questions for pillar 1. But the importance of these issues is for business, for worker rights, for the environment are as critical as ever. But in quite a work program in pillars 2, 3, and 4 that we'll see how they evolve. But Ken, I'm sorry I went a couple of minutes over, but this was a great panel. I just want to thank each of you for joining. And Ken, let me hand it off to you.
Thanks, Paul, Marc, Eric, Wendy, Han-koo. Thank you very much. Really terrific conversation. We have some great questions and a few comments complimenting the panel in the Q&A. We'll take those questions and send them to the panelists so they can see what was asked, who asked them, and if there's an opportunity to respond. I know Marc's answered a few of those in writing back to the people who sent those. Paul, thanks for mentioning the congressional piece. We've talked about that in some past webinars, the role of Congress in trade policy, and this is a great case. You were absolutely right to raise it. You and I both worked in the Senate about why having Congress involved actually is helpful to the administration, because if they can enshrine some of the things that are achieved in law, doesn't matter what gets torn up later, or threats of such. So anyway, just another topic for another conversation, perhaps, about the role of Congress in trade policy. Thanks, all of you, very, very much. Sorry, everyone who stayed on. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks again to the Asia Society Policy Institute and our partner, Wendy Cutler, in this event and so many of the other events that we do. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.